So that is going to be much more the strategy that I would try and adopt to mitigate injury risk, rather than teaching somebody how to land in a manner that they do not move when they're on the court. What's up, guys? This is Keir from Strength Coach Network, doing another reaction video today. This time it's going to be the first one we've ever done on basketball in the reaction series. This is a training session that was performed by Luka Doncic prior to his arrival in the NBA. I'm not sure whether this was before or after the draft, but it was before he went to play for the Mavericks, so he's still quite young in this video. He's still young, but he's very young in this video. He's 19 years old. Now, I wanted to talk about this video because I haven't actually touched on basketball yet in this reaction series, and historically, the training culture in basketball is probably not as established as it is in the other more meathead sports like football and rugby. It's coming up. There are a lot of good people working in basketball, but as with any kind of nascent culture within a sport, there tends to be a lot of charlatans and a lot of crap. So I wanted to show some appreciation to what I thought was actually a very, very good session here, designed and conducted by P3 Performance. So I thought it would be good to give my thoughts on that, and maybe share some of my thoughts on why I think they're doing what they're doing in the body of this session. So I'd say clearly it looks like they're starting out with some kind of like rehab, prehab block. We can just call it injury risk management. We have this banded hip stretch. We know that bands can be useful for joint centration of the hip, and if we can have the femoral head sitting, more towards the center of the acetabulum, that's going to reduce the mechanical cost of activity. It's going to increase his mobility and be conducive to long-term joint health, which when you play a sport that requires you to play 82 games a year and you're 6'6", 6'7", you're heavy, you're going to get a lot of miles on the clock, and if we can reduce that, that's brilliant. We have a Copenhagen side plank. Tons of research out there about this in managing the risk of groin injuries and reducing groin tendinopathy. Likewise with this wall sit. There's a little bit of a divide between the kind of Keith Barr school, which would say that you need to be loading tendons for long duration isometrics to result in structural change to the tendon itself, and that's going to reduce pain, versus that of Jill Cook, which she would just say you need to load the tendon as much as possible and then progress along that spectrum from eccentrics and isometrics through to regular isotonic loading to high speed isotonic loading, to then we start to get into this like rapid eccentric, and then the regular stuff that tends to really aggravate tendons, like jumping and cutting with really big decelerative forces. It isn't necessarily one or the other. You're actually going to see both in this video. You're going to see some heavy or relatively heavy lower body lifting, as well as the long duration isos. We see some slump neural stretching here. The way that it was taught to me is that sometimes a lot of hamstring tightness and pain isn't actually a problem related to the hamstring itself. It's related to irritation of the sciatic nerve, which innervates the hamstring. If you've ever seen in a cadaver, the sciatic nerve is really thick. It's like a friggin' cable, and it goes all the way down your spinal cord, down into your legs. And it's not like it just sits there in your spinal cord the whole time. It is able to move a little bit. And the way that it was taught to me is like when you put tension on both ends of that sciatic nerve by slumping forward and then extending the knee, you start to put a little bit of tension in that sciatic nerve and then move it very slightly up and down. And this feedback to the central nervous system, that movement and that stretch can result in a temporary reduction in those neural sensations that some people mistake for hamstring tightness and pain. We got this kind of quick feet drill on the Polish boxes with ankle E version. You can make a reasonable case for including this kind of quick feet switching on and off activity at the end of a warm-up, just to make sure the athlete is switched on mentally. You're starting to potentiate a little bit, get some coordination and prepare them for the body of the session. I think it's always good to have the end of the warm-up and the beginning of the session be fairly indistinguishable, so that it's just a gradual rise in intensity throughout that session. In terms of putting the ankle into more E version than you would see in a regular landing, you can maybe make the case for like a worst case scenario. If we think about ankle sprains or other non-contact injuries like ACLs and so on, we understand that an injury is going to occur when we're putting athletes into orthopedically risky positions that they can no longer produce sufficient force to resist that deformation of that segment, and that's when we start to apply a ton of stress to connective tissues that are not contractile, and that's when they start to rupture. So if we can develop force production qualities in the ranges that are most risky on the court, we can make a reasoned case that this athlete is going to be more robust to ankle strains in the game. I can't necessarily prove it, but one of the things that I really believe as a strength coach is it's the range that you don't train in that's probably going to be the range that hurts you. So for this reason, I, at least in the early stages of the preparation, I try and work through the biggest orthopedically indicated range of motion that I can, just to cover my bases, and then later on we can reduce that range of motion if, for example, we're trying to chase just straight force production and output. Going back to what I just talked about with resisting deformation and being able to produce forces in extremes of range of motion, there is a good amount of evidence out there to suggest that being strong in hip extension and hip abduction is going to be really important in preventing that valgus collapse that tends to be associated with a lot of ACL tears, which you see a ton of in basketball. And of course, there may be some potentiation effects by starting to generate a little bit of fatigue and force production in these two patterns that we can then take advantage of in the body of the session. With the foam rolling, I used to think back in the day, like many coaches still believe, that when you're applying this mechanical force to tissue, you are creating structural change. You're getting rid of trigger points. $100 to anyone that can find me a picture of a trigger point online. But seeing Charlie Weingroff speak a number of years ago, he kind of enlightened me to the fact that all we're doing with foam rolling is providing some form of input to the central nervous system that is going to temporarily increase range of motion and increase tolerance of stretch and pain, effectively buying us a temporary window of increased range of motion that we can then cement with a load and working through that range in the main body of the session. So we have this elevated trap bar deadlift here. Couple of things. People scoff when you start to reduce the range of motion, especially with a high handle trap bar. It's already technically a reduced range of motion lift, and then he's obviously elevated it up even higher onto boxes. However, when you are almost 7 feet tall, it's a long way down relative to other people that might be, say, like 5'10" like me. You might not be able to get down to a standard height barbell or trap bar without getting into some more mechanically risky positions. As I said earlier, I think if we're just chasing force production, overloading the central nervous system, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using reduced range of motion lifts to do that. I've actually used a strategy with second rows locks in rugby union that tend to be around the same height. They can get up to that close to 7 foot range. And my preference with these guys is to actually overload the central nervous system, develop force with reduced range, and then move through full range in unilateral exercises, things like Bulgarians, single leg squats, and so on. With regard to practicing a single leg landing, I used to think that we could practice the skill of landing aligned. You know, if the hip, knee, and ankle are stacked, we're not caving, we're not bowing, we're not going to be increasing risk of ACLs or ankle sprains. I really do not think that we can do anything about this within a game. Once you start to direct the attention to an external skill, it really does go out of the window. You can just watch the average NBA game, and there are guys landing in awkward positions, inversion, eversion, knee collapsing in, and they actually walk away from it relatively unscathed. So I think we have to beware the invisible graveyard of saying, when you land in this position, you're going to tear your ACL, you're going to roll your ankle, because there are hundreds of guys in the NBA every single day landing in those positions, and they're fine. I think we have to be nuanced in how we look at it. We need to look at, is it just a question of risk where if you buy enough tickets to the lottery, eventually you're going to win a bad prize? But we also have to understand that human tissue is adaptive over time, and I think we can tolerate these positions if we're progressively overloading over time and getting in those reps, that volume that is going to result in a thickening of those connective tissues. And if we increase force production to maybe go up to the edge of what is risky, but still produce enough force to not go over the edge. And I think, you know, the skill of maintaining safe joint positioning is something that can be switched off or lost when the attention is put to an external skill. But hypertrophy of connective tissues and increased force production cannot be switched off. They're long lasting. So that is going to be much more the strategy that I would try and adopt to mitigate injury risk, rather than teaching somebody how to land in a manner that they do not move when they're on the court. Again, watch the game and you'll see that guys naturally have a really good ability to dissipate force by taking these kind of like stutter step landings or continuing to jog, or sometimes even falling over and sliding rather than suddenly sticking their foot into the ground, which we know from force plate data actually increases the ground reaction force and the force going through the joints. So I said earlier that I like to use unilateral exercises to work through that full range of motion and to develop strength in tall guys that may not be as good of a fit for bilateral loading like deep squats. I think that's what's being done here with the sled push, even though the range is not super deep. But Brian Mann, his research, he did a great job of highlighting how much we can improve performance without barbell squatting. I believe he had a quarterback at the University of Missouri, had a herniated disc, could not squat. So all they did with this guy was heavy sled pushes, more load every single week, to the point where he was pushing several hundred pounds. And all of the metrics that they were still interested in improved. And another additional benefit is that we're starting to reduce that eccentric loading, which can make athletes sore, which can make them a little bit more fearful of traditional weight training, which may be an issue in a culture like basketball, which historically is not all about heavy weightlifting like other sports. We got this slide board conditioning here. I think if you look at the primary activities that are making basketball athletes tired, it's mostly going to be the running, it's going to be the jumping, it is going to be some of the lateral movement. But I think if you look at the criteria of dynamic correspondence, if we break it down using that list from Verkhoshansky, the slide board is not going to be that specific to basketball. It may look specific, but it's really not, in terms of things like the regime of muscular work, the contact time available, the speed of movement, and so on. So it's a fairly general training tool. However, remember, we're dealing with a 19-year-old athlete that's maybe not done a ton of resistance training before. He's coming from a sport that doesn't have a really strong training culture. So general exercises may actually be fine to move the needle and make him more robust and perform better on the court. As an aside, I think it was Mike Boyle that mentioned that he used to be big on slide board conditioning on his lateral days. He used to split between a linear day and a lateral day. And if I remember correctly, he said that this actually resulted in quite a lot of groin tightness. And I think if you look at the groin, the adductors, through the lens of like Charlie Weingroff, and say, well, there are prime movers and there are stabilizers. I think sometimes with slide board training, we're asking a stabilizer, that is the adductor, to do the job of a prime mover and just accumulate a ton of reps and contraction with slide board conditioning. So I think it really is a case where we have to ask ourselves, is the juice worth the squeeze? Done sparingly in a young athlete that's going to get transfer, I think maybe it's fine. I wouldn't necessarily do it with an athlete that has a history of groin issues, that is a high training age athlete. I would be looking to condition via other means. Lastly, we've got this isometric hamstring bridge, popularized in recent years by the Irish money printing machine that is David Gray. I would say in this instance it's being used as a hamstring robustness exercise to try and reduce the risk of hamstring tears. Actually quite rare in basketball. Speaking to Jay DeMayo at the University of Richmond, he said to me that basically you almost never see hamstring tears simply because there isn't the distance on a basketball court for guys to get up to the kind of speeds that is going to result in a non-contact hamstring tear. Peter Tierney's research would say actually a significant amount of hamstring tears in rugby at least do not occur in top speed sprinting. They occur in contact situations, in changing direction, particularly when we suddenly have to put our foot out in an awkward position. So it is possible that we will need to address that hamstring injury risk in basketball. Nonetheless, it's free money. It's a few minutes at the end of a session to reduce something that might happen for low or no cost. However, lots of the time, people immediately, whenever they think of hamstring injury risk, they go straight to Nordics. And I think this is a mistake when we think about what the Nordic exercise is. By definition, unless the athlete can go down and come all the way back up, that Nordic is supramaximal in nature. It makes as much sense to impose a supramaximal knee flexion exercise on a 19-year-old, big-bodied, underpowered basketball player as it would be to do the same with a barbell back squat. It's like dropping a nuclear bomb on them when all they need is just a little bit of stimulus to adapt and to bring that injury risk down. Some other advantages of this hamstring bridge is that when you look at Nordics, you see a couple of things that typically happen. One is that athletes get into a lot of like hyperextension in their lower back to try and cheat the exercise, and it turns into what I call a Nordic flop. So you'll have tension for the first couple of seconds, and then they can't hold on any longer, they just flop down. With this hamstring bridge, what you're able to do is set the joint position exactly what the athlete can just about deal with for the time that you want. And then finally, we have much more scope to progress this hamstring bridge intelligently that you don't see with the Nordic. With Nordics, it basically just becomes a case of hold on as long as you can, as low as you can, and then if you somehow manage to do it all the way down, then you can start adding load and coming back up, but it's actually quite rare to do this. On the other hand, with this hamstring bridge, it's very easy to start out bilateral, heels close to the butt where it's easiest. As you check off the times that you need to achieve, you extend that lever, get the feet further and further away until you're fully extended, and then just do the same unilaterally, work all the way out, and then you can start adding loads. So in my opinion, it's a much easier, it's a much more user-friendly exercise to program, and that's pretty much the only thing that I would do differently in this program. As ever, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, share, and comment. And if you'd like to make a request for another installment in this reaction series, please let me know. Thanks. Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thanks.